80 foreign countries. And we'll circulate a link so you can, if you're interested, learn a little bit more about the AEA. The Social Impact Measurement Working Group is called the SIMTIG for short. And we are a group of AEA members who are interested in the topic of social impact measurement and management and exploring the interplay between the social and financial return of investments. We come from a lot of different backgrounds. We have evaluators, evaluator commissioners, investors, investees, et cetera, et cetera. Those in our TIG are typically people who want to learn more about evaluating the social impact of organizations that are aiming to produce both of social, but also a financial return. And you're welcome to join us, whether you are at the forefront of this work or if this is something you're interested in learning more about. So we'll circulate also the link to the SIMTIG. There may be a new name in our future, currently being discussed, but in any case, the link will be a great spot to learn more. I'll also mention that this is one in a series of webinars. So the SIMTIG for several years now has been hosting webinars as an opportunity to introduce people interested in the topic to what a range of different thinkers and practitioners are doing. And we have been hosting those on a YouTube channel, which we will also share the link for. So if this is perhaps the first or one of the first couple that you've had the chance to attend, I welcome you to head on over to that link and check out some of the other content that we've had in past. All of the webinars in the 2023 series are related to the theme of the upcoming AEA conference, which revolves around storytelling. Now I'm going to turn it over to Lissa to introduce our presenters for today.
Thanks, Ben. Hi, everybody. I am Lissa Glasgow. And on the SIMTIG with Ben and with Slavi. And I second Ben in welcoming you to our webinar series. We're really excited that you're here, and we're excited that we're having this conversation with Paul and Jonas today. Details on the next webinar that we'll do in this series are forthcoming, but we're likely to host the next one in early fall, just to get that on your radar. You'll see much more about that in our LinkedIn posts once we get a little bit closer to that date. And now, without further ado, I'll introduce today's speakers. We are really, really lucky to have with us Paul and Jonas today, speaking about an Indigenous lens impact framework. Paul Lacerte, OBC, is a founding managing partner of Raven Indigenous Capital Partners, which is the very first Indigenous-owned financial intermediary in Canada. Paul and his daughter Raven also co-founded the Moose Hide Campaign, which is a national grassroots movement of Indigenous and non-Indigenous men and boys working to end violence against women and children. Paul is a member of the Nadlewutan First Nations Band and belongs to the Carrier Peoples in northern British Columbia. He is a traditional cultural practitioner and spends as much time as possible in his home Carrier territory, learning, laughing, hunting, and gathering. He's the former vice chair of the Vancouver Foundation, a former foster parent, an adoptive parent, a former board chair for Reconciliation Canada, and a former representative to the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He was awarded the Order of British Columbia in 2014. He's also a practicing magician and a sub-average hockey player, which is the line that I love in your bio, Paul. Jonas Hunter supports the design and implementation of impact measurement and management at Raven Indigenous Capital Partners and Raven Indigenous Impact Foundation. For the past 12 years, Jonas has provided leadership, strategy, and operational support for social purpose startups and nonprofit organizations, prior to which he founded and led an enterprise software company, which he operated from Macedonia. Jonas, who is of mixed European descent and grew up in India and Japan, brings a multicultural worldview and a love of nature to his work. He's grateful to live and work in the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations of Vancouver, BC. And today, they'll be telling us all about the Indigenous Impact Framework they've been working on for several years and have recently published about. So Paul and Jonas, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a huge honor for us to be here. It's one of our top three corporate priorities this year is to engage with the ecosystem and to contribute, I think, to this pathway of reconciliation, the space between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, and to offer some reflections on the learning journey that we've been on in understanding impact measurement in a way that works for Indigenous peoples and is inside of an Indigenous epistemological container. I see there's a few people that I know here. So hello to all of you and good morning, and a special hello to Dr. Pam, who I haven't seen for a few years now, and some of our friends at Bisocial and Common Approach. So so lots of pretty incredible people on the call. So again, a huge honor to be with you. I'm just going to share a few words in my carrier language, and then see if Jonas has any opening thoughts, and then we'll pivot into our presentation and leave time for questions if that's a reasonable approach this morning. Yeah, great. And it's important as we're sort of decolonizing and reculturalizing this process to make space, as terrible as some of our Indigenous accents are, as we're relearning our languages. And as much as I get teased by my elders in our home territory when I talk to them in carrier, it's not without practice that we're going to get better. So I just wanted to say Hadi, Dineza, Tsekeza, and I wanted to just greet you all this morning as my respected relatives. And we say that because if you think about your mother and her mother and her mother, all the way back to your first mother, it's Mother Earth. So if you follow that unbroken matriarchal line in your life and you go, well, who's my first mom? And we all have the same first mother. And so the Coles Notes version of Indigenous epistemology of things that you might hear from people like Dr. Chief Robert Joseph is this idea of Namwaya, that we're all relatives. And that's one of the many underlying rationales for why Indigenous epistemology encourages us to embrace each other in that relationship, that you are each our respected relatives. Gilam Gilo Satni, Sagana Lexiliu and Janye Kaktane Keo. My traditional name is Gilam Gilo, and I come from the Carrier Territories, which is in northern British Columbia. Sagana Lexiliu. I'm a Caribou clan member. Slu, I get that from my mama. We're a matrilineal society. Snachalia in Jen Lakwangan Keo. I'm just so grateful to be joining you today from the Lakwangan People's Territories. And just see, Jonas, if you have any brief opening thoughts before we jump into our presentation.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, it's just great to be here with you all, and recognizing that there's folks here from Canada and the US and Brazil and different regions, and you know, a lot of our work is done from a Canadian perspective, and it's really it's something that's been special for us is in these types of conversations is that the learning goes both ways, and it's been really special to be able to learn from the work of others, and many of those on the call here as well, which is a part of the work that we have in our impact measurement framework. So passing back to you, Paul.
Awesome. And also, I see that I actually have a cousin on this call too, Arlene McDonald, and through my mom's family. So a big hello to Arlene. Hey, cuz. And we have a family reunion coming up, so we're going to get to see each other in Nova Scotia next month, I think. So yay. Okay, well, with that, we will pivot to our presentation. Jonas, if you have the power. And if not, Ben, if you can make Jonas co-host. Ben has the power. Wonderful. Okay, thumbs up, Jonas, if everybody can see that. Okay, great, wonderful. Okay, so we'll jump into the presentation then, Jonas, if you want to skip to the next slide. Yeah, so you heard a little bit about Raven Capital, and of course I'm just so incredibly thrilled and honored and really humbled to be a founder, co-founder, together with Jeff Sear and Stephen Nairn, two pretty incredible human beings, of Raven Indigenous Capital Partners. It's the first Indigenous owned and led financial intermediary committed to purpose-driven investment platforms, and that's both in the social impact bond space and in the impact investing space. And we have now built two of Canada's first Indigenous-owned impact funds. Raven Indigenous Impact Fund 1, which we raised and almost fully deployed all during the pandemic, which was a nifty trick, for $25 million. And we just closed Fund 2 recently, and that was at $100 million with a strategy of deploying that fund, about half of that fund here in Canada and half in the United States. We'll go to the next slide, Jonas. Just briefly, where our approach is to try to understand Indigenous ways of knowing and being in the impact investing space, to practice it in a way that makes sense to Indigenous people. There's a lot of inertia in the impact measurement space. There's a lot of language, there's abbreviations and acronyms, and there's complexity in the language that we use. It's very technical and very exclusive to Indigenous people. Many Indigenous people are not comfortable in this space. And so, you know, if we're going to realize our objective of leveling the playing field and involving and including more Indigenous people in this work, it's really important for us to shift our language. And so a lot of what Jonas and I have been doing is trying to find new and more inclusive ways of talking about this work and practicing this work. And you'll hear about that through the course of our presentation. It won't be a bunch of PowerPoint slides with bullet points. It will be screen captures and images of the work that we're doing. And as much as possible, we're wanting to share as much of our knowledge with you as we possibly can. On the left picture, you'll see the way that my workstation is set up. Often when we're doing impact screens, or when we're running an IMP or a theory of change workshop with founders, that this is actually a fairly common scene in front of my laptop, is to have medicines out, because there's so much deconstructing and reconstructing that we need to do. We need to remind our minds and our spirits about that there's more than one way to do this work. And so that's my own approach of building cultural safety and good solid reminders and sacredness for myself. On the right is a short video that we're going to play for you now, give you a sense of our invitation here. I cannot hear the sound, Jonas. Early in our journey, we set about creating the Indigenous impact measurement framework we refer to as the RIM. We're here today to welcome you into that journey, to welcome you into our big house, and to invite you to enter into a traditional mindset, to enter into a cultural mind, to come into a sacred space for us, so that the way that we think about and the way that we practice impact measurement makes sense for Indigenous people, is anchored in Indigenous ways of knowing and being, and is ultimately focused on improving the well-being of Indigenous peoples in our communities all over Turtle Island. As we welcome you into the big house, we invite you to reflect on the nail that's beside the door. We invite you to hang your concerns and any negativity that you may have on that nail, so you can enter the big house in a good way that you can enter with a clear mind and a clear heart. We invite you to sit around the council fire with us and reflect on the well-being of Indigenous people. Hold ourselves accountable to those traditional teachings that will ensure that all of the work that we do together, the Raven Indigenous Capital Partners, with our investors, with our portfolio companies, and with our partners, ultimately results in the well-being of Indigenous people now and for generations to come. Thanks, Jonas. We'll go to the next slide. So what the picture that you see here on the right is a cedar bentwood box. When we created our first impact measurement framework, we knew that we needed a manifesto or a covenant that would do a few things. One is clarify our core values, principles, and epistemological framework. And two is articulate and delineate our impact measurement practice. And I guess three is to clarify our accountability to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There's a lot of global frameworks out there, and the one that we have a primary alignment to is the UN DRIP. And it is, again, one of the, and we'll talk about it a little bit over the course of the presentation, but it's certainly one of the things that we are advocating for broader adoption by impact measurement practitioners. Inside that cedar box goes our impact measurement framework. So we had a ceremony, we smudged it. A lot of our investors, I think, might have been new for a lot of our investors, including our institutional investors, to see a meeting of an impact management firm where we have a document that we're smudging, we're drumming, singing, we have a cedar bentwood box made for it, and we're putting it in there. And it's just to signal the depth of our commitment and accountability to the well-being of Indigenous people. This is the words that Jonas and I say at the beginning of every meeting that we work with founders, so that they're really clear about what our mandate is, and that our team has a standard approach of articulating the way that we work. So we'll go to the next. So just a few thoughts, and then I'm actually going to turn it over to Jonas shortly here. You'll feel in this presentation this idea of creating a cultural container. At all of our meetings, we practice like this, and invite folks into a bit of a different way of engaging with each other. We focus on relationships. I talked a little bit about sort of the epistemology of and the importance and the centrality of relationships. And I think that's good for all of us. So we pivot more toward less towards transactional and more towards relational. It's really critical for us to share knowledge and teachings as we're continuing to decolonize and reculturalize, and to invite everyone into the space of sharing knowledge and teachings. And a lot of times in our context, that's storytelling. Tomorrow, we're hosting an impact feast with our investors, with all of our investors in both Fund 1 and Fund 2, and we'll be releasing our annual impact report. And a huge portion of that report is storytelling, verbatim storytelling from our founders. We do our work in ceremony. We think that, you know, for the work of Raven Capital, if we're gathered together to be in the service of the well-being of Indigenous people, and to be clear, you know, the social and economic status quo for Indigenous people, including but not limited to murdered and missing Indigenous women, is unacceptable. And this sector can be in service of creating a different future than the past that we've had, and should be. So standing together to create change around those realities is sacred work. And if what we're doing together is sacred, it's not a meeting, it's a ceremony. So part of building that cultural container for all of our relatives, we signal that we're working in ceremony. And you know, this webinar and other efforts that Jonas and I and the team at Raven Capital undertake is really about engaging the ecosystem to advance those 4 principles above that you see here. So we'll go to the next slide, Jonas. So I'll turn it over to my brother to take us through the next few slides.
Thanks, Paul. So yeah, the next couple slides just kind of high level our approach and kind of the life cycle of our engagement with portfolio companies. And you know, as just to kind of to step through these 4 sections on the left here, you know, as Paul mentioned, our initial approach is all aligned with the core mission of Raven, which is Indigenous well-being. So our desired impact that all of our outcomes go towards is the well-being of Indigenous people. And I really recommend that folks, if you haven't seen our framework, if you're interested, it's on the website. And we speak to some of the values and principles that we follow, and one of them is one of two-eyed seeing, which it really shows up in many different ways. One of them can be an Indigenous and mainstream or traditional and mainstream approach to impact measurement, or it can look like, you know, being in ceremony and being technical. You know, so there's different ways that we look at that, but that's a core part of the work. And in many ways, as a non-Indigenous person here, that's, you know, I'm showing up as well with, you know, kind of holding that with Paul, you know, the Indigenous and non-Indigenous side of the work. And that's just to speak briefly as a team at Raven, you know, mostly Indigenous, but also non-Indigenous folks. It's a learning journey for us. So our impact screening process, we've done a lot of development. We did a lot of development with it last year as well. The indigeneity piece is really important, which we speak to a little bit in our impact report, which is going to be available at the end of this week. So our, you know, kind of framing is really around the theory of change, and this is a story that we put together really with our potential investees. And then we, you know, through that, understanding what the outcomes are in their language and how we're going to measure that across the, you know, the 5 dimensions of the impact management project, or impact frontiers. And just a nod here to some of the folks that have really helped us of Common Approach and Impact Frontiers. So to speak briefly to our process or life cycle, our engagements are a couple upfront workshops that we do with each company to understand how to measure impact with them, what their impact is, really understanding it from in a space of story. And it's just, you know, we have our fund team often tell us that they don't hear the things that come up in these sessions, in these workshops. Sometimes it's just, you know, night and day different from, you know, what they're hearing versus what comes up in these sessions. So we do these first couple workshops. Once they come on board, we'll do you know, a survey and story session at the end and the beginning of the year towards the impact report. And then we do you know, an annual CEO retreat, and in the summer we do a feast as well, which is happening tomorrow. And this is really our engagement with the companies, being in relationship with them, and we're constantly working to improve how we're in relationship with them in better and better ways. So I'm not gonna, there's a lot here. This is it. We'll provide some parts of this in the impact report, but this is an internal document. But just to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at when we go through the screening process. We weight really highly internally on impact on the Indigenous side of the operational impact, the indigeneity of the founders and the company. Again, there's a lot of data here, so I just kind of want to share that this is Cheekbone Beauty's placemat from last year, and we do this for every company. You know, their outcome here is to create a space which includes products and services of other Indigenous brands for Indigenous youth to feel safe and proud of where they're from. They want to create space in the beauty industry for Indigenous youth to feel seen and heard. They've actually, we have another outcome for them as well as an example, but this is the way we design outcomes with these companies. It's really the heart of what they want to see in the world. And sometimes it's challenging to find indicators and measures, but it's often different from traditional metrics that we're looking at usually in impact investing. But we really work to have this represent what's important to them as a company. And as you can see on the right, we align with UNDRIP and UN SDGs at an outcome or company level. So a big part of our measurement work comes down to balancing the indicators with story. We sometimes weigh the story part of measurement in some cases as highly as we do the indicators, because it's difficult to manage some of the social change that's happening from the enterprise. So a few key metrics here. Like Paul mentioned, the Raven Fund is now at 125 million. 71% Indigenous ownership across the company, across the portfolio, and which is really great. And another one here is, let's change my screen so I can see it a little bit. Yeah, so across 25 investments in 11 companies and 32% Indigenous employees. So there's 127 Indigenous employees at companies. So we look at these numbers sometimes. That 32% might not seem a lot. We'd love it to be 75%. It's sometimes tough to find Indigenous talent in certain industries like tech or banking, but it's when we look at that number of 127, that's a big deal, and we're really proud of that. And so we're looking at raising percentages as well as numbers across the board. So we have outcome themes from a portfolio level that are really based on what we've seen from the companies, from the impact that they're creating. So impact on the community, wealth creation and ownership within the enterprise, environmental stewardship, and an economic reconciliation, which has a lot to do with storytelling on a larger scale, the scaling of brands and founder voices. And that includes activities like we're doing here today. And I'll pass this back to Paul.
Is the next slide, does it have the DRIP, the background context, Jonas? Okay, we'll go back to the last one.
So
can you revert back to the last slide? Okay, yeah, great, yeah. Sorry, Jonas. So just wanted to talk about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples for a minute, and just to give a little bit of a background context and the relationship to our work, and the brief version is that the negotiation of the terms and the development of the terms of the UN DRIP started in 1972, and it was amongst a human rights working group that was reporting up to the UN Human Rights Council, and it took from 72 to 84 for the first set of articles, the 46 articles of the DRIP, to be developed, and it took from 1984 to 1996 for those articles to be negotiated and approved by and to be presented to the Human Rights Council. So 24 years. And it took from 96 to 2006 for the Human Rights Council to approve the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and then refer that up to the UN General Assembly. And of course, in 2007, the UN General Assembly voted on the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, but 4 countries voted against it: Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, with Canada leading an effort to convince other countries to also vote against the UN DRIP. Since from 2007, all 4 of those countries have reversed their opposition and have now embraced the UN DRIP. But it wasn't until 2021 that the government of Canada enshrined the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples into law here in Canada. So it's the UN DRIP Act. And so there are sort of broadly analogous grounds for economic development in Indigenous territories across Canada that has, you know, significant implications for the future, particularly of the natural resource economy here in Canada. But it also has implications for folks like us that are doing fund management. And so we have undertaken a pretty significant commitment to and effort to find alignment, both for our firm and for the companies that we invest in. And again, you know, this is an invitation for other folks to think about the alignment of your own firms with one or more articles of the DRIP. And for Raven Capital and our partners, we are an expression of Article 3 of the UN DRIP, which states that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. And Jonas, if you go to the next slide. So this is a little bit more of a detailed description of our portfolio companies. The primary outcome of each of those portfolio companies, the UN DRIP articles. So there's 46 articles, but a lot of the articles in the UN DRIP have more than one section or subsections to them. And so you'll see the bracket is for articles that have subsections to them, and then the wording of the UN DRIP article. And then you'll see something called the Indigenous Navigator. And for those of you that are interested, the Indigenous Navigator operates out of Denmark. It's an EU-funded organization. And what they've done is broken down the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People into 13 impact categories. So the DRIP was really written as human rights legislation with a lot of government to government or nation to nation jurisdictional language throughout. So it's not seen as readily available to the investment space as the SDGs are. And yet it's also a global guiding framework. And so Jonas and I actually thought that we were going to have to do that work of breaking down the UN DRIP and doing that analysis so that we could create indicators and aggregate those indicators against one or more of the articles, with an objective this year of Jonas and I will be going in April to the United Nations in New York City. And we'll be the first fund manager, we think, to present an impact report that is specific to giving expression to various articles of the UN DRIP through a fund management lens, and that we'll have specific indicators that we've measured and quantified our contribution to the implementation of the DRIP. So the Indigenous Navigator description of those 13, one of those 13 impact categories is what you see on the right. And there's a fair amount of technical work that the Indigenous Navigator has completed, which is broadly available for folks that are interested in advancing your practice in this area. Any thoughts that you had about this slide, Jonas?
No, well, you know, we do our best in collaboration with each company to align with the single UNDRIP, but there's often more than one, and it is not as direct and goal oriented as the UN SDGs. It's really, I think it's really towards more of a really creating thriving life beyond just you know, getting folks out of poverty and getting up to a baseline. So it's great to look at the Navigator, but I also recommend just taking the time to read through all the UNDRIP articles as well when you have time.
Yeah, agreed. And Joanne Norris had a question in the chat. It's a great question. I'm curious about the power dynamics with your key investors and this approach. Has there been significant pain points in implementing this approach relating to power, or are we targeting investors who are already convinced of this framing? I would say two things, John. The pitch deck and presentation materials that we provided to prospective investors were very clear about sort of our theory of change, that we think that particular inputs and particular activities with Indigenous founders will result in particular outputs, which are inclusive of commercial performance. And we're actually really proving that theory out now, that the level of, you know, bespoke managerial services and support, the cultural safety that we've created with Indigenous founders, and the decolonized way of talking about this space and engaging has really resulted in you know, like outsized commercial performance of Fund One, as well as particularly for Indigenous women, which are half the founders in our portfolio, and we're all men. The three founding partners, not our whole team, but our three founding partners are all actually also white presenting men, that we're inheriting a very complicated power dynamic internally as well. And so what we've said to our investors is, you know, we have to be very, very intentional in this context. And I would, as opposed to running into power dynamics, I would say they all showed up because they have either a DE&I mandate and they're wanting to lean in, or they have a reconciliation mandate and they're wanting to lean in. So there's a level of curiosity that has been a pleasant surprise, and a level of willingness to learn. And so that's not that there's a lack of accountability. It's just that there's a really stated openness for a different approach, which I'm so grateful that our portfolio is performing well commercially, because it's also sort of proving that you can decolonize the process as best as possible and still have strong commercial performance.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Great answer. And this is super exciting.
And then two more questions here. And I think this is the end of our presentation, so we'll actually shift to questions, if that's okay. And then I see that our website has been put into the chat. So our impact measurement framework is available on our website. We have shared it as an open source document. We share it as medicine. So we wanted to, yeah, just share good medicine and hope to provide as much support as possible to the ecosystem as we're all continue on this learning journey. And as Jonas said, our 2022 impact report takes a little longer in this space to generate, but it'll be available this Friday. So you'll be able to see what the RIM looks like, and then the RIM's implementation by way of our annual report looks like by this Friday. So, and I also see that folks from Raleigh are here too. So just another shout out to the incredible people at Raleigh Assets, a huge supporter and a big part of our success as well. So thank you so much. Okay. So we'll go to questions. Do you want to just stay out, Veronica? Did you want to stay out the question directly?
Sure. So hi, everyone. This is Veronica. And I have two questions. I think, Paul, you answered one a little bit, which is more about what the financial return looks like. And so I'll just ask the second question, which is based on, I said extractive, and as I said it, I was like, well, you know, my foundation is based on, funded through the extractive mining industry, but just generally, when I ask that question, I actually mean it from just investment specifically. And so do you ever get pushback from your either social enterprises or your overall Indigenous communities about engaging at all in the capital market, because the resourcing that is actually driving the impact investment and the funds generally come from pretty much more capitalistic systems, we have found that that is typically a non-starter. And we can't change the system in which we work. So we find it hard to engage. Yet Indigenous communities is a big focus of our philanthropic capital. And so I'm curious about, now that you've turned that off, I can put my video on. I'm curious about whether or not what would be your response to that, and whether or not that has ever been something you've contended with.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, we have some exclusions on the inbound and outbound side for capital, and it's the standard ones. You know, things that go boom, things that are associated to tobacco. For us, cannabis is in the a space that we're not either investing in or taking investment from. The big financial institutions are a really complicated one, Veronica, for us. And we have had significant discussions around the larger financial institutions that are pretty heavily invested in the tar sands, for an example. And so the answer is that we've built enough relationship capital with our founders that they know that as an intermediary, what we're trying to do is not scrub or launder dirty money and do good with it. What they know is that we're going to take an ethical lens in the relationships that we build and the kind of money that we onboard, and use that money and deploy that money for the best possible effort to lift up Indigenous peoples. And so we have had one situation where we declined an investment, and we've had 0 situations where our investees, our portfolio companies, have raised specific concerns about folks that are sitting around the table of LPs in either Fund 1 or Fund 2. Yeah, I don't know if that answers the question or not, but yeah, it's a really important question in this space. Yeah, and even with the philanthropic investors that we have, and I've done a fair amount of work in the philanthropic space, when you look at asset bases, and particularly older asset bases, you know, a reasonable question is, were some of these assets derived from Indigenous territories that were expropriated? And was that expropriation process, notwithstanding that those resources are endowed, was that expropriation process or those resources the way that they're derived ethical? And so that's a little bit more of an invitation for us into the philanthropic space, is just, you know, the more difficult and challenging conversations about reconciliation and what righting past wrongs could look like, you know, not just in capital markets, but in the philanthropic sector.
I think Andrew had a question, Paul, and I can answer it if you want.
Yeah, go ahead, Jonas.
So Andrew, yeah, we do have our headline metrics, which are essentially, you know, looking at Indigenous representation across the organization, the customer. We also are aligned with some iris metrics around DE&I, and we're adding in more and more metrics that are specifically around, let's say, you know, reconciliation action plan, climate action plan, and going through that journey. The climate one is interesting because these are early stage startups. So they're now asking us more and more, what should we do? So they're not going to have, you know, plans in place and things like that. But yes, we do have headline metrics that we're tracking across the portfolio.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Andrew, just building on that, data collection in Indigenous communities is also a complicated piece, and particularly for founders and as Jonas said, earlier stage businesses that are just really struggling to stay above water. The level of rigor that we need to have as sort of the first Indigenous in financial intermediary and these investment funds requires a lot of interface between us and our portfolio companies, and it's been a journey to try to shift the optics of the relationship from really burdensome and extractive to being additive and actually love-centered and healing. And again, I can't say it enough of the positive feedback that we've received from founders just by simply building a cultural container at the outset of a conversation that's actually about data collection or collecting stories. And just something simple like that signals that we're not there to do what people have done in the past, which is collect data from Indigenous people and then use it against them. Or use it in a way that's disrespectful or extractive to the community. So you know, this idea of collecting metrics, headline, and then aggregating them across the portfolio and then reporting out is something that we have to take a great amount of care with. And tomorrow we'll be hosting an impact feast with all of our investors and all of our founders and some of our partners. And the founders and CEOs get a chance to share their stories of impact directly with our investors in a cultural container. So we do a fair amount of cultural protocols at the outset. It's a 3-hour convening. We do it every 6 months. And it's one of those things that our CEOs refer to as saying, oh, okay, I get it, you know, and I'm also going to Series B. So, you know, here is an opportunity to advance the narrative and build out the value proposition of our company in the minds of people that might want to co-invest going forward. So,
Thank you for sharing all that context. Do you also enable the founders to own their data?
yeah, ownership, control, access, and possession. So for the folks that don't know, OCAP, ownership, control, access, and possession is a sort of the gold standard of research that's being conducted in Indigenous communities. And Jonas and I and our founders have done a ton of work around all 4 features of OCAP and are co-defining with each of our portfolio companies what that looks like. And the big variable that we're working on right now, without any clear answer to it, Andrew, is the ability of portfolio companies to withdraw data or specific data points from our database and from access by our founders. So one of the exercises of ownership and control, if it's true, is the ability to erase or withdraw permission for data to be present within our system. And that is a point of discussion that we have in play right now. We also convene an annual in-person portfolio retreat. So we were just last month in Southern Utah, and I was able to convene, Jonas and I were able to convene our founders together for 3 days of strategic conversations. And that point, this point of OCAP, data sovereignty for Indigenous communities, was pretty front and center in the way that we're building out our system. So Liz, so looking through the questions here, as an early stage business, see the type of impacts we're targeting, target impacts will depend on the community wants and needs. It depends. This is something to attract the interest of impact capital so far. Navigated this challenge in partnership with you. The types of impacts being targeted. I mean, it's not as much of a challenge in the Indigenous community, certainly in Canada, because of the hegemony amongst Indigenous communities, the shared historical experience of residential schools, the existence of the Indian Act, some things that have been ailments that our problems we're solving for in Indigenous communities. It's a little bit different in the United States, and we're learning about the regional differences and the fact that there is a lot less hegemony in the context of what folks are solving for. And a good example is a business development trip we made to Hawaii, where we learned that there were no such thing as residential schools or Indian boarding schools in Hawaii. So they're actually not solving for that at all. They have a very strong intergenerational connection and family identity. They're solving for the physical displacement of their people from their territories and the commercialization of their, like the Hawaiian shirts or tourist shirts. Actually, those plants are fundamentally important water sources for Hawaiian Indigenous peoples. And so the pictures on the shirts are something that, you know, that's the battleground of cultural reclamation and cultural IP. So there's a lot of learning that we're undertaking about the different jurisdictions that we're investing in. But here in Canada, there's a fair level of similarity for the problems that we're solving for. So we were able in the RIM to identify that previous state, the current state, and our desired future state with a fair amount of similarity across the province or across the country. And our investors, I think, understood that. And it's a little bit of an advantage. It's challenging, but it's a little bit of an advantage in the Indigenous space because of the shared experiences around Native residential schools and displacement from our territories due to legislation. Does translation Indigenous languages come in your surveys and reports? Great question, Tiffany. No. I can talk relatively well in my carrier language, and I would love to have and find ways of translating any of our work into our own Indigenous languages, but we have zero capacity around that. In fact, this year, we're even just building the capacity to reproduce and re-articulate the RIM, the impact measurement framework in French. But that's not a translation exercise, that's a development exercise because of the économie sociale in Quebec. So Slavi had a question. So I will what sort of collaboration and competitive things we can do to support Indigenous inclusion and impact investing together. Aiden at Creative Fire, yay, right on, Aiden. Great question. We're taking as least a competitive position as possible. Fund 2 is closed, so it's a little bit easier for us to say that now. One of the things that we are moving towards this year is a convening in the context of sort of a community of practice of folks that are wanting to lean further into this space and develop our shared capacity. Yeah, and again, you know, this opportunity for fund managers to do their work in understanding better the UN DRIP and declaring the alignment between your firm and one or more of the articles of the DRIP, and then adding the UN DRIP into your impact reporting process, we think is a really important pathway for increased solidarity with Indigenous communities.
So Ben, I think we'll turn it back to you. We just have a couple of minutes left here. I don't know if there was any other questions that we missed.
I think we covered them.
Did you respond to Slavi's question? I just read.
Yes.
Oh,
that's a great one. Yeah.
When you use storytelling to demonstrate impact, how do you deal with scale and reach? We rely on traditional impact statistics and Western approaches to data analytics. How do you deal with scale and reach? Yeah, interesting. So the rationale around storytelling is that we come from oral traditions. And it's predominantly how we communicate as people. We tell stories, and numbers and data tell some part of the story, but not all of it. And so there are, for example, now AI tools in which you can input verbatim stories and they will spit out outcome themes. So it's an impact measurement specific analytical tool. Jonas and I shy away from that. And what we do is more so on a portfolio level basis, and you'll see this in our impact report. We report both, and we think both sides tell the story, that the data tells a part of the story, and the storytelling itself tells part of the story. And you know, as much as we may get to aggregated outcome themes that are harvested from the stories, currently what's most important to us is making sure that every portfolio company in our impact reporting and in our direct engagement with our investors has the ability to share stories of impact and talk about the way that investment capital is making a real difference in the lives of Indigenous people without having to aggregate everything. That there is a spirit to this work, and there's a reason that all of us are here, and often that is something about the heart and spirit of the work that we're doing. Jonas, I don't know if you have a different answer to that in the last minute here.
I think that's great. And in terms of scale, it's a work in progress. We're constantly, you know, we'll work on some indicators. We'll have stories come against them, and it might change. So we're doing the best we can, and it's a mix of an art and science.
Great.
And Ben and Andrew, yes, absolutely. The RIM is appropriate for settlers and for settler-led investees. It's the reason that we're sharing it, is that we think that things like you know, the epistemology that we're all relatives, that we need to change the way that money behaves from being extractive to being healing, and love, that it needs to represent love. One of our companies said their OKR, or one of their KPIs, is 1,000 acts of love, 1,000 registered acts of love, to turn it into a metric. And then quarterly, their teams get together and report on it, and then they have an inventory. And it's an Indigenous tech company. So there is ways for us to have our cake and eat it too in this context, but it's absolutely available to be used to deepen all of our impact measurement practices in a way that makes sense to each of you. I think we're out of time, so Ben, we'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, thank you. Fantastic. I mean, just a great ton of content coming through today. So really want to give my thanks to both of you for sharing some really concrete examples of what you're doing, also some of the thinking and deep thought that's gone into the tools, the frameworks, etc. So thanks again for all of you. We're going to have this posted online on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to access this again in future, or perhaps share it with somebody who wasn't able to join today, that'll definitely be an option. And of course, as I mentioned in the kickoff, this is one in a series of webinars we're doing this year. We anticipate the next one is going to be in October, topic TBD. So we will be sharing out more info on the upcoming webinars and hope to see you at them as well. Thanks again, and enjoy the rest of your days.
Nice to see you all. Take care.
Thank you.